Hello, and welcome to the third lecture of this course. This lecture is part of the first module dedicated to feminist theorizing and rethinking gender and war. Let me first briefly introduce myself, and then we will start our lecture and meeting. I am a philosopher, cultural theorist, and gender scholar, professor of the Academic Department of Social Sciences, and also coordinator of the Center for Gender Studies at the European Humanities University. My research interests include gender representations in cinema and visual arts, feminist philosophy, film theory, and semiotics. What this lecture is going to be about? Women's experience of facing with the war may be very diverse. The memories of the destructive consequences and its framing on both personal and social planes are likewise different. One can speak here of the experiencing of emotional shock, physical pain, surviving sexual violence, and so on. These modalities of the memories are very much determined by the structural possibilities for the individual agency on either side of the front. It is an experience that is difficult to bring to common denominator and even more hard to talk about. Yet we gain knowledge on these experiences through various literary texts, media representations, and multivocal documented evidences. While raising the question of what is there in common in the women's perception of war, I would like to propose to reflect on the gendered experience of war and the forms of its remediation in verbal and visual representations through the concept of the female gaze, yet without essentializing, because I would like to underline that women's perception of war, as well as the gendered optics of male and female gaze, is defined not by biological sex, but by social, structural conditions that determine a particular subject position and point of view. Whereas my lecture will be mostly centered on visuality, I nevertheless consider it useful to extend the application of the concept of female gaze to a broader range of cultural representations. In this discussion on the relations between vision, gender, and war, the works by feminist film and visual scholars will help me to maintain the conceptual integrity of my arguments. In other words, I am interested in how women's experience of war is framed through visual optics when being articulated and medialized in oral narratives, literary texts, cinematic representations, and photography. My lecture will be structured as follows. We will have 4 parts: the concept of the female gaze, theoretical framework, then the eye of the camera, ethics and poetics of the photographic images of war. Third part, unrepresentable and unspeakable, unspoken silence tabooed in the storyboard of women's narrative on the war. And the fourth part will be dedicated to my personal film list for further reflections. So in the first part, I would like to consider conceptual approaches to the problem of the gaze as it has been theorized in visual studies, cinema, photography. Here it will be necessary to explain why this concept of female gaze is so important for feminist theory, and why the concept of the gaze and the modality of visual perception are always about gender-based experience, not only in cinema but also in everyday life. Then, secondly, we will discuss with the eye why the eye of the camera, the photographic gaze, and the war are so closely interrelated in the images of death, suffering, destruction. In this part, I would like also to discuss the problem of ethics and poetics of the gaze in visual representations and documenting of the war. Speaking of the war, I will understand it in a broader sense, as lived experience of those who directly faced with the war or endured its consequences. Third part. Here I would like to discuss how the unrepresentable and unspeakable relies on the visual, or how the traumatic experience of war and the memory of it are captured and memorized through visual images that convey multiple points of view, while reflecting different subject positions and articulating the heterogeneous experiences of war through gender optics. The point of view, the very notion of point of view, is implied here not only in an epistemological sense, but also in quite literal way, as a particular specific position of scene. In other words, the issue of gender lens in the perception of war is not only about what exactly the female gaze is directed at or fixated on in any given moment of time. It is also about how visual snapshots of war are imprinted in memory and oral stories about it. And in the final part of my lecture, I will offer, as I said, my personal, very subjective filmography consisting of 11 films produced in between 1959 and 2020 by both women and men film directors from different countries, for further reflection on the representations of the gendered gaze in the movies on war or on its traumatic consequences. A brief overview of the useful sources. Here I provided several names, and I will refer to these names later and works later in my text. And right now I would only say that on the feminist theory of the gaze, you can learn from texts of Laura Mulvey, May Andown, Kaja Silverman, Anne Kaplan, Bell Hooks, and other feminist scholars. The book by Chowdhury Shoini is also helpful in this respect, as it provides an overview of the feminist theories of the gaze and highlights the key points in the existing approaches. In what concerns the text of Marta Gellhorn, Svetlana Alexievich, Jane Gallagher, Carol Acton, I suggest you to read them for the reflection on visual and discursive specificity of women's accounts on the experience of facing with the war. I touch on this topic in the third part of my lecture. You can also note that the title of my lecture actually refers to the books of Svetlana Alexievich and Marta Gellhorn. A very short comment on Virginia Woolf's essay, Three Guineas, which was written and published in 1938. It doesn't have directly link to that what we are going to discuss today. However, I would like to draw your attention to this text because the way how she links of the private and the public and how the structures of patriarchal society led to militarism, these issues remain an important argument for today's world. Drawing on feminist film theory, starting with the concept of the male-female gaze coined by Laura Mulvey, and engaging with the text written by Virginia Woolf, Susan Sontag, Svetlana Alexievich, and other authors, I propose to reflect on how does the act of seeing, looking, often burdened by the impossibility to turn away the eye, to divert the gaze, transform into the gendered gaze, imprinting war in the individual and collective memories through a series of close-ups, and how these memory snapshots are being embodied in various narratives and mediated through words and images, in order to retain and convey the experience of the unspeakable to the others. The concept of the gaze is one of the key notions in the studies of visual culture. You can find different elaborations on this issue in psychoanalysis, film theory, phenomenology, gender, and postcolonial studies. You can come across in the relevant literature further ramifications of the same notion. To give but few examples: the gaze of the other, the colonial gaze, oppositional gaze, the gaze of bystander, the diverted gaze, and so on. So let's begin with the introduction to the key concept of feminist film theory and speak of the female gaze, how it was elaborated and theorized. And then we'll talk about how this conceptual apparatus may help us to watch films differently, in particular when we speak of the representation of women's experience and memories of the war. The incursion of feminist theory into the sphere of film studies took place in the mid-70s, and that had significant consequences for both film theory and feminist criticism. The first wave of feminist film theory was strongly inspired by a psychoanalytical approach, namely by Lacan, Metz, and others. It was in the framework of psychoanalytic film theory that a whole range of issues concerning subjectivity, ideology, and spectatorship had originally been developed. Later, feminist scholars turned to the theories of subjectivity, to the methods of textual analysis in film, theory of enunciation, to reception studies, and so on. The crucial issue in the context of psychoanalytic film theory is the problem of producing viewing subjectivity within the scopic regime, which involves the idea of primary and secondary identification in cinema. The production of subjectivity has been understood in two contrasting ways, either as binding, totalizing operation or as the one that implies a constant process of division and lag. Each option suggests a different idea of how the cinematic apparatus affects its viewer as a psychoanalytic subject. The cinematic apparatus constructs its spectator and then structures the screen relationship along psychoanalytic modalities of fantasy, scopic drive, fetishism, narcissism, and identification. The text which paved the conceptual framework for feminist film theory was Laura Mulvey's famous article Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, which was originally published in 1975. She argues that the unconscious of patriarchal society has structured film form in such a way that the socially established interpretation of sexual difference controls images, erotic ways of looking, and spectacle. Mulvey noted that every cinematic operation, and particularly the processes associated with the gaze, namely identification, voyeurism, fetishism, reinscribes the subjective structures of patriarchy. With this text, Laura Mulvey considered destruction of pleasure as a radical weapon, because in a world ordered by sexual imbalance, pleasure in looking has been split between active male and passive female. Woman is posited as an image, man as a bearer of the look. She also pointed out that spectatorship in the cinema is organized along gender lines, creating an active male spectator in control of a passive female screen object. The operations of spectacle and narrative combine to dictate specific masculine and feminine viewing positions, according to a standard which is implicitly male. The cinema makes its appeal to the spectator's unconscious along two lines, that of scopophilia, in which an active subject derives pleasure in looking at a passive object, and that of narcissism, ego libido, in which a sense of self is reconfirmed in the unity of the screen image. Both activities are related to the eroticism of the gaze as the basis for voyeurism or to the fascination of the mirror stage. By orchestrating three looks, those of camera, of characters, and of spectator, film produces a specific eroticized image of a woman, neutralizing the masculine position to the spectator and the pleasures that entails. For Laura Mulvey, the possibility of destabilizing the voyeuristic gaze represents the most promising option for an alternative cinematic practice. Mulvey defined the terrain where feminist film theory subsequently discussed issues of gender spectatorship. She delineated three major points. First, there is no gender-neutral representation, so it is worth analyzing the place of women within representation. Second, there is no genderless spectator, so it is necessary to define the position of a male viewer. And third, cinema reproduces the relationship of power at the level of vision. Another scholar, Mary Ann Dawn, in her articles Film and the Masquerade of 1982 and then Masquerade Reconsidered of 1988, also explored the available viewing positions for the female spectator, for the one who finds herself either too close, that is, absorbed in her own image as the object of narcissistic desire, or too far, assuming the alienated distance necessary to identification with the male voyeur. In her view, either position involves the impairment of female subjectivity for the woman, that is, the perpetual loss of sexual identity in the act of viewing. What are the possibilities for a woman as the subject of the gaze in cinema? Mary Ann Dawn suggests that the pleasure available to female spectator relates to the liberating dislocation of the feminine gaze. Mary Ann Dawn asserts also that female spectatorship is never entirely foreclosed, repressed, or irretrievable. Even in its negation, it is produced, a position empowered to issue a radical challenge to dominant modes of vision. At this point, let me remind you that we are talking with you about the theories of the female gaze, which were formed under the dominance of patriarchal stereotypes and the limited opportunities for the enunciation of women's viewing subjectivity, which were specific for film and television industries in the analog era, that is before 1990s. Feminist theories of the female gaze were formed at a time when both the creation of content for cinema and television and the methods of their distribution were very centralized and practically didn't allow women to articulate an alternative point of view, as it's happening now in the era of social media. At the same time, if we take a closer look to the contemporary media culture, we will find out that much of that what feminist visual scholars wrote about 40-50 years ago had not lost its relevance. The technological conditions of production have changed quite radically, and the means of production and self-expression have become accessible to virtually everyone. But the issues of gender stereotypes and the recognition of women's agency, also as a subject of the gaze, remain pertinent. Here I would like also to draw your attention to the typology of the gazes developed by British scholar, semiotician Daniel Chandler in his Notes on the Gaze of 1995. He identifies the following forms of the gaze that can be found in photographic, filmic or televisual text, and in figurative graphic art. I think this typology can be helpful in addition to the feminist approach in order to critically reflect on the construction of the visual field in contemporary visual culture, and to use it as an analytical tool in your own work if you need to conduct a close reading of some visual text. So here we have the spectator's gaze, the intradiegetic gaze, the direct or extradiegetic address, and then the look of the camera. Although we are talking about primarily about the gaze when we deal with cinema or literature, we must not forget about the narrative instance and the voice, as the construction of female or male subjectivity in the text implies the analysis of enunciative position, the position of focalizer, that creates complex relationship between the one who sees and the one who speaks, between narrative and visual agency. The notion, you can see here the brief definitions, the notion of enunciation was elaborated first by linguists, namely Emile Benveniste and some others, and it means the process of the production of a statement. It differs the what has been said from by whom that has been said, from what position it emanated. As for the notion of focalizer, in narratology, it implies a character through which the story is told, and whose perspective in the story is told from. Feminist film scholars have always been very attentive to the construction of a feminine enunciative space and what role does a female voice, along with focalization, plays in the cinematic narrative. Such questions are often raised in discussion of films made by female directors. One can retrieve a position for female enunciation in films which deliberately change the dominant cinematic codes and represent the consciously alternative to mainstream cinema tradition. This issue gains its relevance also when we analyze not only films but also women's narratives. We need to consider how they see and what they saw at the moment, likewise what they see and how they tell about it. Thus, the concept of female gaze does not imply the position of a universal narrator or recipient. In each specific case, the female gaze implies the multitude of different points of view, representing different subject positions and capturing the heterogeneous experience of war through a gendered optics. Perhaps many of you are familiar with Susan Sontag's famous book regarding the pain of others, which was published in 2003. And this book seems to raise many important questions for understanding the connection between photography and war. There is an excursion into the history of military and pacifist photography, the analysis of the relations between photography and various desires, the study of various aspects of the manipulation with photographic images and of the ethics of the photographer's and viewer's gaze. When reading this book, each of us as a viewer relates that what we read with our own experience of browsing through shocking photographs that leave indelible after images in our memory, having decisive importance for our perception of history. Here I would like to quote Walter Benjamin's phrase on that history breaks down not into stories but into the images. And so this is particularly important in cases where we cannot rely on our own memories of the event, we were not there, but thanks to photography, we get a feeling that we were witnessing the scene. Sontag's book is also relevant because without photography, there is still no war. It is photography that renders war and its destructive consequences visible and immediately present. The history of photography, war, reportage, forensic, proves etymological affinity between photography and death, not to be a mere coincidence, especially in English, where the verb to shoot has a double meaning of photographing, taking a picture, and of actual shooting with a gun. The word shot stands for both a snapshot and discharge. Let us not forget that the invention and development of photographic techniques is closely linked to the weapon's optics. In other words, the camera's purpose was predestined by its technological origination. Susan Sontag considered camera to be a sublimation of the gun and called the act of taking picture a subliminal or a soft murder. There is an old debate about the ethics of photographic gaze. Whose purpose does photography serve, and what are the consequences of publicizing the images from the war? Can photography cause moral harm and entail the danger for those whom it would like to present as in heroic light? Some aspects of the theory of the gaze, which I presented in the first part of this lecture, need to be discussed further in relation to the theme of death and the images of suffering in photography. The concept of the gaze is not reduced to a simple act of looking. It goes together with self-contemplation and implies that the gazing subject is aware of being also looked at. We speak here of a particular modality of power relations between the gaze subject and the subject the gaze is directed at. When Susan Sontag wrote that there is an aggression implicit in every use of the camera, she refers to that very decisive moment when the camera usurps the power. Quote, "To photograph people is to violate them by seeing them as they never see themselves, by having knowledge of them they can never have. It turns people into objects that can be symbolically possessed." In our highly mediated everyday life, we often find ourselves in the position of a split subject, occupying either the position of a photographer or that of the subject photographed. In case of selfie, both of them at the same time, but also that of spectator or witness. This mutual reciprocity of the positions of subjects is inherent only to photography from all arts. To comprehend this multiplicity, let us pose a question: how does a man or a woman with a camera actually sense the danger of the aiming gaze, the one who takes a photograph, or the subject who turns out to be the target, the one who becomes the object of shooting? The issues of ethics and bioethics of the photographic gaze directed at the pain of others have always been important for photographers whose work was connected with war photo reporting, for editors who have to define the limits of acceptability in publishing photographs, documenting atrocities or representing mutilated bodies. But also it was important and is important for artists who manage photographic archives of death and war, and for museum curators who take risks when dare to publicly present images which initially has not been designed, has not been created for a sterile museum life. In the global photographic archives of war, there is a wealth of evidences of military atrocities and human tragedy, as you can see on these photos from war in Ukraine. What exactly is represented when it is visualized, and what cannot be captured, either for technical or ethical reasons? The female observer's physical act of seeing, as well as the refusal to see, for example, a battlefield, a wounded soldier, a torture victim, the bombed city, or a wartime hallucination. This has been articulated and represented in photography, cinema, oral history, and memoirs of the war times, written by women. While some consider war photography to be a male-dominated profession, many women photographers have worked in war zones. They have documented conflicts all around the world and played a decisive role in shaping the images of the war. Unlike their male counterparts in conflict zones, women photographers often have access to families, of which they produce some especially moving portraits. They are also active they are also active on the front lines and take photos of war victims that rarely spare the observer. I would like here to refer to some recent exhibitions that featured works of women who photographed the war. Here you can see the title of the exhibition, which was recognized as one of 10 best exhibitions in the United States in 2022. That was called Women at War. It included 12 women authors, not only photographers. And this exhibition was a touring exhibition, was curated by Monika Fabianska, and you can find actually the reports, but also an interview with Monika Fabianski if you'd like to learn more on this exhibition. Another exhibition, which also might be important to mention here, it was an exhibition that was held in Paris in 2022, and it was called Women War Photographers. It featured some well-known women photographers who made reports from international conflicts, starting from the 1930s, namely Lee Miller, Gerda Taro, Catherine Leroy, Christine Spenger, and some others. By highlighting the images taken by these 8 women, war photographers, the exhibition confronted the visitor with a collective view on the violence of war. It explored the notion of gender, specifically the female gaze on war, and undermined established stereotypes in showing that women are just capable of photographing and witnessing atrocities as men. And now we proceed to the next part of this lecture. Unrepresentable and unspeakable. In this part of my lecture is inspired by such authors as Svetlana Alexievich, Jean Gallagher, and Carol Acton. Jean Gallagher asserted in her book, which is called The World Wars Through the Female Gaze, published in 1998, she asserted that vision played an important role in the development and gendering of cultural discourses about war. In her book, she focuses on how the gaze is articulated. She defined gaze as both a visual act of seeing and the visual verbal representation of that act for a reading or a viewing audience. The gaze is continually subject to the various forces that constitute wartime visuality and subjectivity, and that attempt to direct or constrain the act of looking and the interpretation of visual experience. Carol Acton noted the relevance of Gallagher's approach to the relationship between seeing and writing, and she developed it further, centering in her analysis on the diversional narratives, on the relationship between what is seen and what is not seen. And in particular, she examined how the diversion of the gaze and the attendant paradoxical presence of the unseen text is fundamental in understanding the connections between seeing and writing war. As for diverting or averting the gaze, I think that many of you have been familiar with this experience since your childhood. Not only in those situations when something terrible could have been happening in reality, but even during watching some scary movie, when the viewer anticipates the scenes of torture, execution, murder, and so on, he or she involuntarily wants to close the eyes or to look away from the frightening scenes. Also, I would like to note that the connection between seen and unseen is far more complex as it may seem from the first glance. The basic condition is when certain scenes are not seen, cannot be seen, or can be seen only partially. Then there is a professional vision, that is professionally determined ways of seeing. A surgeon, a sapper, or a pilot see differently. And this defines the relation between seeing, knowledge, and action. But this conceptual pair, that is seen, unseen, may also be gender-specific, when certain visual information is not registered, seems not to be important, or passes unnoticed, and vice versa, when it's being circumscribed by gender-specific experience and cultural constraints related to it. As Carol Acton notes, seeing war as a woman is compounded by the gender anxieties and questions about the legitimacy of the female gaze. These differences become apparent further in the verbalization of what was seen and what retained in memory. This concerns also the realm of speechlessness and the unspeakable, of that cannot be described or cannot be written about. Here I would like to refer to the book by Svetlana Alexievich, a famous Belarusian writer, which I also included into my bibliography. Her book, The Unwomanly Face of War, was written in 1983, based on interviews with hundreds of women who took part in World War II. It presented the female experience of war. The book represents the collective voice of those who remained silent and who remained unseen in the shadows of great history. Women often kept silent because their experience, contribution, and sacrifice were seen as unnecessary and devalued in post-war patriarchal society. Also because they themselves often didn't consider their personal stories significant in the context of the bigger tragedy, and they considered that their contribution to the common cause as heroic and worthy of being recorded. Alexievich reveals the connection between hegemonic ideological discourses and women's experiences of the war, their perception of war through the prism of dominant narratives and memories of it. Women were silent because no one asked them, and no one asked them because there was no room for their memories in heavily biased, heroic and masculine ideological narratives of war. It is characteristic that many women preferred to remain silent because they were afraid of public censure, both those women who fought at the front line and those who were in the occupied territory. All of them could have been stigmatized. At that time, Svetlana Alexievich had been heavily criticized for pacifism, naturalism, and for debunking the heroic image of a Soviet woman. In my view, such a criticism directly refers to the above-mentioned thesis of Carol Acton on the question of the legitimacy of women's gaze on the war. That what critics of Svetlana Alexievich considered to be naturalism may be explained by the divergence between women's accounts of what they saw and between the legitimized official narratives that were privileging the heroes and silencing the traumatic experiences. In addition to that, the accounts of women were full of shocking details representing the images of the unspeakable and that what was often silenced because of the cultural constraints. In other words, the hierarchy of socially significant and personal, intimate in women's accounts of the war differs considerably from men's stories. Women often frame and interpret the events differently, not necessarily following the chronological framework and avoiding the black and white binary thinking. The presence of the eye of power in women's and men's stories may also differ considerably. Before proceeding to the last part of my lecture, I would like to equip you with some tools for your own work. These instruments are foremost helpful in the film analysis, but I propose to use the cinematic lens also for reading oral histories, documenting women's facing with the war. And this would also explain why do I use the word storyboard in the subtitle of part 3 of my lecture. A storyboard is a visual representation of how a story will play out, scene by scene. Many war films are based not only on literary text, but also on memoirs, diaries, and oral histories. We deal here with a double conversion. First, there is a conversion of what was seen into a verbal narrative, and then in cinema, the verbalized transforms again into a visual image when we talk about feature films. In other words, the experience of war is first imprinted in memory through an image, visual or audio, then converted into visual verbal form, but ultimately the resulting effect still remains closely related to that what was seen or heard. The cinematic storyboard, but also voice-over narration and diegetic dialogues, which might often seem as insignificant at first glance, are full of effective images. In cinema, the multisensory experience of war plays a special role and can be recreated by a variety of visual techniques through frame composition, editing, sound design, color dramaturgy. In cinema, the multi-sensory experience of war can be transmitted through purely cinematic techniques and tools such as frame composition, angle, editing, and so on. Moreover, just in the memory of storytellers, a close-up, visual or acoustic, plays a special role, articulating the immediate facing with the war. While medium shots or long wide shots convey either the impersonal gaze or the mediated experience, when the war is perceived as a temporal or historical distance. And so below, that what you can see here on the slide, I will like to explain in more detailed way. For many contemporary viewers, the perception of war has long been associated with the cinematic representation of the battlefield as seen through the viewfinder of a machine gun, or a sniper's aim, or photographer's camera lens. Computer games have intensified the experience of immersion through the player's focalizer's position, but in many games it was still the gaze of a viewfinder. However, the great battles of the past were often represented in painting and then in cinema as a panoramic bird's eye view, or with the help of the long wide shot. In a digital age, the reality of the war is rather seen through the eye of a drone. By offering a bird's eye, the drone provides a complete picture of any location. Technicians who are directing the drone are in a position of detached observers who are also more empowered as they are able to view the entire setting from above. Such an extensive surveillance and control is not possible without technical means. But what is also important is that the eye of a drone is a machine gaze, endowed with a technical task and deprived of any emotional, subjective dimension. This is a super eye, the eye of power, but it is also a depersonalized, nobody's, non-gendered gaze. This topic, the role of the gaze of drone in the modern warfare in a digital age, has been extensively explored during last decade, and in particular now in the context of Russian war in Ukraine. So I will not delve into it. That what interests me is a view from a very close distance, that is an anthropocentric human vision, which represents facing with the war in a close-up, and as such it remains on the other sense of the sequence shooting. So here we have here you have some examples of the iBird's view and the gaze of drone. Here I just remind you what is the long or wide shot. Usually it's used to establish a scene and give viewers an idea of the environment that the characters inhabit. So typically it shows the entire object of human figure and usually is intended to place it in some relation to its surroundings. Then we have also medium shot, including American shot. It's when a camera angle shot from a medium distance, favored in sequence where dialogues or a small group of people are acting, and the shot is cutting the person in half. Here, by the way, what you see on the left, it's the picture made by Robert Capa in 1944. You probably know the story. It also relates to the photogram on your right side from Malena. Close-up or extreme close-up. It's a type of shot that tightly frames a person or object. A close-up is taken from head to neck, giving the viewer a detailed view of the subject's face. So a human eye, which faces war in the immediate reality, captured it in a close-up shot, and therefore stays in a position to the bird's eye view. As I said above, when the events are represented in wide shots and edited in a conventional, that is consequential storyboarding, then most likely in such a snapshot we can sense the effect of ideology, that is of big history, as it has been filtered, reworked and represented in official narratives. And that what we find in the visual evidence and individual oral narratives of the war may be read as an alternation of shots in sequences edited from close-ups and medium shots. As for the use of flashbacks in the non-linear narrative, the jagged or choppy editing style, unconventional storyboarding, these instruments help to articulate both the subjectivity of the gaze and the non-linear nature of the individual memories. And now let's proceed to the last part of my lecture, to the representation of the gendered gaze in the movies on war. And as I said, I would like to propose you a list of films for further reflections. Until the late 50s, the female experience at war was represented in feature films made mostly or exclusively by male directors. However, after the release of Hiroshima Mon Amour, a film by Alain Resnais based on the script by French writer Marguerite Duras, and then also later when Liliana Cavani made her film The Night Porter, the situation drastically changed. In the USSR, such a breakthrough was made by Laisa Shepitko, a Ukrainian Soviet filmmaker, in two of her films, Winds and Ascent. It is also worth noting that many films about the war shot by women directors often presented the world of the private life, of the everyday, personal experiences, traumatic memories, family concerns related to survival, migration, etc. Certainly this is not accidental, considering that women face the experience of war often through the prism of everyday scarcities. In male mainstream cinema, this private female experience has often been marginalized. It is not only spectacular and does not fit into epic narratives. In certain sense, it's also not commercially attractive. And that's why there is such a big difference between the representation of women in mainstream cinema and in television culture. But precisely in this regard, I would like to draw your attention to two films from my list. These two films, in my opinion, stand apart. It's the Hannah Arendt film by Margareta von Trotta and The Hurt Locker by Katrin Bigelow. So here you have the selected filmography. The titles are listed in chronological order, the year of release. You can see here films made by both women and men filmmakers, which narrate both stories from different parts of the world and different periods. I will only briefly guide you through the list without plunging into the detailed analysis, which I usually do as a film scholar. So here we have Hiroshima Mon Amour, as I said, a film by Alain Resnais and Marguerite Duras, produced in 1959. Then we have Winds by Laisa Shepitko of 1966. The Night Porter, a very controversial film made by Liliana Cavani in 1974. Come and See, a film by Ilya Klimov, which is based on the novels by Olesya Adamovich, Khatyn. Then we have Before the Rain by Milcho Manchevsky of 1994, a Macedonian war film, which has a very interesting narrative structure. Here we have The Hurt Locker by Katrin Bigelow of 2008, and this film is now considered to be one of the best war films of the 2000s. Hannah Arendt, as I said, by Margareta von Trotta in 2012, a biographical drama film, which you probably know, and it's this film relates to the well-known text written by Hannah Arendt on the banality of evil. Then we have a film Hemingway and Gellhorn by Philip Kaufman, 2012. I wouldn't say that it's one of my favorite films. I think it might be even rather weak. The important thing is that it it represents actually the story of Martha Gellhorn. And then we have Girls of the Sun by Eva Usson of 2018, which is about a war correspondent when she here you have also the particular story of women from Iraqi Kurdistan. I also included a film by Valentin Vasyanovich, which he produced in 2019. The film is called Atlantis, and it was intentionally made as a dystopian post-apocalyptic film. So actually now, speaking of these like 2 years of the full-scale war in Ukraine, this really sounds scary. That it's not really about post-apocalyptic; it's about apocalyptic times that came in 2022. And the last film, which is here, It's Sisters Apart by Daphne Kayezani, produced in 2020. Again, this film tells the story of the Middle East, of a German woman soldier from Germany with Kurdish Iraqi roots, and the film tells about her desperate search for her sister, a Kurdish fighter battling ISIS. So here is the list of all films, and before I finish, I would like to say a few words instead of conclusion. Since the beginning of the full-scale Russian war in Ukraine in 2022, there have been produced already quite a few fiction and TV documentary films produced by Ukrainian and international filmmakers, as well as TV series, like for instance Ukrainian-French-German co-production, a TV war series named In Her Car. Due to the limited time, I will not delve into the analysis of the recent film production. This awaits us ahead when the war is over. In this lecture, I aim to provide you with a theoretical framework which may help to analyze women's narratives of war, mediated by literature and cinema, and to present you a broader panorama of films and text that spark a light on the commonality of women's experiences in different wars. By comprehending the situation of the current war in Ukraine and its media representations, we understand that in the current circumstances, feminist discourse matters, both in Ukraine itself and in other countries. In other words, the gender-specific experience of war, as well as its media representations, are now being interpreted by us in a completely different discursive field than it was during the wars that took place in the 20th century. Gender theory has made us sensitive and attentive to any forms of objectification through the gaze, as well as to the forms of visual violence that are not necessarily associated with explicit physical violence. And most important, it gave us a language to describe and reflect on what is happening. Thus, instead of conclusion, I would like to invite you to reflect on the following question. To what extent do feminist optics and gender theory help you to comprehend various forms in representation and medialization of the ongoing Russian war in Ukraine, in photography, cinema, musical video, and other audiovisual text? Thank you for your attention.